Hi, my name is Jeff. This is my wife Debbie. This summer, we took our 2019 Tesla Model 3 on a road trip from Sunnyvale, California to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to visit family and friends. The Model 3 is our first electric vehicle, or EV, and we are a bit uncertain on how it would perform on a road trip this long. We had tried to look into the experiences that other Tesla owners had on trips of this length, but found very few references. So we wanted to make sure we would share our experiences with you. We'll be sharing photos and videos we took of our trip along the way, as well as sharing our experiences.
During our 15 days of travel, we drove 5,324 miles round trip between Sunnyvale and Milwaukee. The trip to Milwaukee took just over 44 hours to drive, traveling 2,259 miles. Finally, our return trip to Sunnyvale covered 2,762 miles. Following this travel plan, it took us about 4 days to reach our destination, driving about 9 hours a day. We spent 5 days in the Milwaukee area, and it took us about 6 days to come back home. The trip to Milwaukee took just over 44 hours to drive, traveling 2,259 miles. Of this time traveling, 8 hours 49 minutes were spent at Tesla supercharging stations, while the remaining 35 hours and 15 minutes were spent driving. This roughly lines up with the time predicted by Google Maps. We plan to average about 600 miles a day based on our hotel options and the supercharging network on our way to Wisconsin. On the drive back home, we didn't track driving time quite as closely since we spent time sightseeing as opposed to our more direct route to Milwaukee.
Round trip, we stopped to charge 30 times at Tesla supercharging stations for a total time of 22 hours and 2 minutes. This came out to an average of about 44 minutes per charging stop. We also did 3 overnight charges at Tesla destination charging stations that were located at hotels we stayed at. They are slower than charging at supercharging stations, but since we charged overnight, it was not an issue. This was a great feature in that it saved us time and money. We did most of our traveling over major interstate highways and found the charging network to be well laid out over these routes. We never worried about miscalculating the need to recharge our Model 3 because the number of supercharging stations were well placed throughout the interstate system. While we were in Wisconsin, we charged for a total of 1 hour and 36 minutes in Madison, Wisconsin, and in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, which is in suburban Milwaukee. Unfortunately, the supercharging network in Wisconsin is not very robust. For example, in Madison, Wisconsin, a city of over 250,000 people, the only 2 supercharging stations were located on the east side of town within a half a mile of each other, near where Interstate 90 goes around the city. We can speak similarly about the availability of supercharging stations in Milwaukee, the state's largest city of about 600,000 people. That being said, we understand that plans are in place to increase the number of supercharging stations in the near future. Supercharging is super easy. Once you're plugged in, your vehicle is automatically beginning the charging process. Walk away to get lunch or groceries, and then periodically check the status on your Tesla app. And once charging is completed, the transaction gets linked up to your Tesla account and ultimately gets posted to the credit card that you have on file with Tesla. Our fastest charging time was 16 minutes. In that time, our battery capacity jumped from 55% to 83%, an increase of 28%. We found that starting a charge at a lower battery percentage resulted in faster charging during the early stages of the charge, although this tapered out as the battery reached a healthy battery percentage. The superchargers really live up to their name. Most charge up to 150 kilowatt hours, which is about 25% of the average California home power consumption in a single month. So it's really efficient at recharging your vehicle. The Reno, Nevada supercharging station actually charged at 250 kilowatt hours. In fact, most of the new supercharging stations being installed around the country are at 250 kilowatt hours. During the charging process, the car will provide you with a variety of information, like how much charge you may need to get to your next stop, as well as how much charge you'll have remaining at your next destination. Per our experience, we found that Tesla's navigation system had us stopping on average about every 160 miles to charge, although this varied depending on a number of variables, such as speed that we drove, places where we wanted to stay overnight, changes in elevation, etc. Before we would arrive at the next charging station, the navigation system would tell us the total number of stalls as well as the number of stalls in use. This feature came in very handy when figuring out when and where to stop. On our travels, we found the largest number of charging stalls was 16 and the fewest number was 4, with an average of anywhere between 6 and 8 charging stalls. We did end up having an issue charging in Lovelock, Nevada. The chargers there were not charging nearly as efficiently as other supercharging stations along our trip, and it was a general problem that was experienced by other Tesla owners as well. We decided to leave that station as soon as we had enough charge to get to our next destination. Our total charging cost round trip was $292.41. We found that our average cost at a supercharging station was about $9.75, with an average of a little more than 44 kilowatt hours per stop. This comes out to an average cost of about 22 cents per kilowatt hour. Generally, at supercharging stations, you're going to be billed per kilowatt hour. However, some supercharging stations will bill you per minute at 2 different price tiers. You'll be billed a Tier 1 charge if you're charging between 0 and 60 kilowatt hours, and you'll be billed a Tier 2 charge if you're charging above 60 kilowatt hours, with the Tier 1 charge being roughly half the cost of a Tier 2 charge. Some regions and their respective energy restrictions or requirements make it difficult for Tesla to sell electricity at a flat cost, so they had to resort to per minute charging. So our longest travel day by distance and time took place on the same day, when we covered 614 miles in 11 hours and 58 minutes, with charging time accounting for 3 hours and 5 minutes of the total time. Kilowatts charged during the trip was 60.5, which over the course of 22 hours of total charging time equated to 1,330 kilowatt hours. This equates to nearly 18 full battery chargers during the course of our trip. According to the EPA, 33.7 kilowatt hours is the equivalent of 1 gallon of gas. So technically, if an internal combustion engine vehicle was as efficient as our Tesla, we could have covered our entire trip using about 40 gallons of gas, which is the equivalent of about 2.5 tanks full of gas. This really goes to show how inefficient gas cars are compared to EVs, and it also shows how much room EVs have to grow as they develop. Again, we traveled 5,324 miles on this trip. Assuming we did this trip in a gas car at 25 miles per gallon and a 16-gallon capacity, we would get a range of about 400 miles per tank. If we refilled our gas tank when we had about 40 miles of fuel remaining, it would mean that we had about 360 miles of range between fill-ups. Therefore, we need to make about 15 refueling stops at just under 15 gallons per stop in order to travel the same distance. Covering that distance, we would have consumed about 216 gallons of gas, which at a cost of $2.25 per gallon would have cost us $486 for the entire trip. One thing you'll become acquainted with on your first trip in an EV is what's called range anxiety, and that is, how worried are you that you'll make it to your next destination with adequate battery charge? It turns out in our Tesla, we didn't have to worry much at all. Again, with this being our first long-distance road trip in our Tesla, we told ourselves that we would maintain a 15% battery buffer, or the equivalent of 40 miles of distance. Now, we didn't spring for autopilot when we bought our Tesla, but we did use the cruise control feature to maintain a highway speed in the range of 75 to 82 miles per hour. We found that driving in this range did not have any negative impacts on battery usage. However, if we set the cruise control at 83 miles per hour or above, we found that it did negatively impact the rate of battery consumption. We want to note that cruise control is pretty easy to use. You can adjust your speed from 1 to 5 miles per hour at the press of a button. Arguably, the coolest feature of cruise control is that you can set the car length distance for the car in front of you. Your Tesla will use its sensors to maintain that distance for you. Additionally, you can quickly use the buttons on your steering wheel to manually slow down your car in situations where you don't need to apply a foot brake. We found that the best leg of our trip in terms of battery efficiency occurred when we traveled 250 miles on a 75% battery charge. This calculated out to a full range equivalent of 334 miles. This leg of the trip was from Reno, Nevada to our home in Sunnyvale. It's interesting to note that we achieved this result in part because of the 4,400-foot decline in elevation between Reno, Nevada and Sunnyvale. On the other hand, we found that the worst leg of our trip in terms of battery efficiency was when we drove from Roseville, California to the Lake Tahoe area. On this leg of the trip, we drove only about 82 miles, but consumed 42% battery charge. This calculated out to be a full range equivalent of only about 194 miles. On this leg of the trip, we went up about 5,600 feet in elevation. Our experiences show that elevation gains and losses play a big part in determining overall battery consumption and efficiency. Earlier we touched briefly upon the operating efficiency of our Model 3 compared to gas-powered vehicles. One such comparative measurement is MPGE, or miles per gallon equivalent. Now, our Model 3 has an MPG highway rating of 112. According to our calculations based on total miles driven and the number of kilowatt hours of energy consumed, our rating was just over 120 for the entire trip. Now, between passengers and cargo, the car carried between 400 and 450 pounds of weight throughout our trip. We also had our air conditioning and USB chargers operating for most of the trip. So we think it's pretty safe to say that given what we threw at it, our Model 3 performed quite admirably in terms of overall operating efficiency. During our travels, we came across a number of areas where there was some extensive road work being performed, resulting in reduced speeds. However, that didn't affect battery performance in an adverse way, because driving at slower speeds is when the car is more efficient. In fact, we found that when we were driving through areas of road construction when the speed limit was 50 to 60 miles per hour, the rate of battery consumption actually decreased.
The Tesla software is really easy to use. Once you enter in a far enough destination that would require a charge en route, the navigation system will automatically consider the most convenient charging stops along the way. The software will even show how much battery you will have by the time you arrive at your first stop. And along our travels, we found that the battery levels predicted by the software as we arrived to our next stop were within a range of plus or minus 2%. Really, the largest discrepancies we found along our journey was that the charging times were underestimated by about 10 minutes. So if the car said that we would take 40 minutes to charge, it really took 50 minutes. In the instance that our battery would reach zero by the time we reached our next destination, the software would warn us so that we would either decrease our speed or just stop sooner to charge. Now, we previously mentioned that we self-imposed a battery buffer of about 15% throughout this trip. If we could preset the software to add a battery buffer of a predetermined percentage, that would be really cool, but it's not currently available. It would be awesome to tell it you want to optimize faster charging stops, regardless of whether or not there's more stops overall. The actual driving experience of the car is quite comfortable. For starters, you set up what's called a driver profile. Once set up, you simply hop in the driver's seat, select your profile, and your seat, wheel, mirror, and even AC settings will change to your preference. This especially made co-piloting for the road trip a lot more seamless. The seats themselves are really comfortable. There's a lot of storage inside the cabin and even more in the front and rear trunks. The car itself is quiet when you're driving, but when you're driving 80 miles an hour, you'll of course hear the wind and the occasional tire movement. The car's battery is on the bottom of the vehicle and is very heavy, so the vehicle's overall center of gravity is really low, which makes the car overall feel very sporty yet smooth. The only time we ever had to stop at a gas station was just to use the window washers to wipe the bugs off our windshield. Overall, we're happy we put our Model 3 to the test. Our range anxiety decreased as we learned over time we could trust our navigation and software system. The ebb and flow of driving, charging, and driving again is pretty predictable, which is a good thing. The only negative is that the current range constraints require more stops, which just take up more time overall.
If you have the time, we think taking a road trip with any of the Tesla models would be an enjoyable experience. One final thing to note, and that is the supercharging network is still relatively new, and most of the supercharging stations are along major interstate routes. So that said, if you want to divert off the interstate system, you'll need to plan accordingly. Over time, of course, the supercharging network will become more robust, but it's something to consider if you're watching this video sometime in 2020 or 2021.
It goes to show that this technology is so new and moving so fast that the supercharging networks, the battery, everything in 5 years will be so different from what it looks like today. We want to give a big shout out to our friends and family that we saw on this trip. It was so much fun to see their first reaction to the Tesla.
Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about our experiences, please leave them in the comments section and we'll try to address them. Take care.